Oh, hey, CNFers. Many of you know I like to crack open a beer on this pod sometimes. Sometimes it contains alcohol. Sometimes it's a near beer. I've been selected as a brand ambassador for Athletic Brewing. I just sent them a pitch. I like what they do. I like the beer, and I figured, why not throw my hat into the ring? And they plucked me out of the slush pile. Anyway, they're a brewery that makes my favorite non-alcoholic beer. Shout out to Free Wave, their hazy IPA. And if you use the promo code BrendanO20 at checkout, you get 20% off your first order. You can head to athleticbrewing.com and order yourself the best non-alcoholic beer I think you'll ever drink. I mean it. Also, I don't get any money. I get points towards flair and beer, but no money. Check it out.
I liked it. Well, you liked it. Why? I hated it. Well, why did you hate it? I just didn't like it. Well, what didn't you like about it? I don't know. You know what I mean?
That is my guest today. Our guest, Malaka Gharib. Malaka is so cool, and what a delight to speak with. She works for NPR Science Desk, but odds are you're familiar with her because of her cartooning. She's prolific on Instagram with her cartoons. This is something she wants to do more of, and we'll get into that in the show. Her cartoons have appeared in the New Yorker, LA Times, in The Believer. I mean, a couple of rags, am I right? She's the author of the graphic memoir, I Was Their American Dream, which was named a best book of 2019 by like a billion places, including the Washington Post, another rag. Has anyone heard of these publications? Her latest book is It Won't Always Be Like This, a graphic memoir. It's a touching memoir, so specific to her summer trips to visit her father and stepmother and step-siblings, as it would come to be in Egypt. Memoirs are supposed to be specific, not sprawling autobiography, but something really granular. And this drills down on those awkward adolescent years and how Malaka began to find her footing in the world, while also illustrating the Arab family from the inside out, namely her father and Hala, her stepmother. Some of you know I like to post comics and zines, and then I delete them because I'm a shithead. But when I see graphic memoirs, I'm just like, man, I dig that form. I love comics. I love one-panel comics. I love the economy of the storytelling. It's more immersive to me. It's very immersive. Malaka, she posts a lot of zines and little comics that she just kind of scribbles off and posts them. It's very entertaining. She's got a great newsletter also about like beautiful things that she likes to link up to. Kind of like my Rage Against the Algorithm newsletter. Anyway, we'll get to that. Anyway, my drawings are largely rip-offs of Brian Ray, so I have a lot of discovery when it comes to my own cartooning. Oh, by the way, I'm Brendan O'Meara, and this is the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, the show where I speak to badass people about the art and craft of telling true stories, and sometimes the art and craft of telling true stories involves graphic memoirs like Kristen Radke's Seek You, Malaka's book, Michi Ng's Barely Functional Adult. Awesome stuff. Hey, show notes to this episode and a billion others are at BrendanO'Meara.com. Hey, there you can also sign up to my Up to 11 Rage Against the Algorithm newsletter. Yeah, that one. I mentioned it earlier, like 20 seconds ago. This is where it's at, CNFers. I'm not one to hang out on social media, but I am one to put a lot of effort into my kick-ass monthly newsletter that entertains, gives you value, and sticks it to the algorithm. Sticks it right up the algorithm's keister. If that's your thing, sign up. Been doing it for a lot of years. First of the month, no spam. As far as I can tell, you can't beat it. All right, my parting shot at the end of this episode will deal with the Patreon jam, but for now, this is a fun one. Please enjoy my conversation with Malaka Gharib. I'm a big aficionado of sorts of zines and stuff like that, so it's like I've always plugged into your zines on Instagram or whatever, and so it's really cool to see like this monster zine that you were able to do in a graphic memoir.
That's exactly how I see the graphic novels. I just see them as monster zines. I didn't know how to create anything longer than like 25 pages. Sorry, 24. Actually, we have to think in terms of zine pages in multiples of 4. A 32-page zine. I haven't done anything longer than that, so I just basically strung the chapters together as if they were like 9 individual zines.
What's your favorite zine format?
Oh, that's a really great question. You know, I've tried many zine formats over the years. When I was in high school, my uncle was a doctor and had a copy machine in his practice, and I would just print out zines there. So when in that age, I loved just printing out 2 sheets of paper that were printed back to back and then folding them together. And that was my I think that was like a 16-page zine, maybe like, I don't know, 8-page zine. And I like to make mini zines out of 1 sheet of paper. And sometimes if I get really fancy, I'll go and get it professionally printed at my local Kinko's and get it bound together, which is very, very fancy in the world of zines. But I think my favorite type of zine is like get it done now and make it easy. So I love any kind of zine that I can just, if I have access to a copy machine, that kind of zine that I can make on the fly is my favorite type. Messing with like a printer and doing anything more professional than that just feels less punk for some reason.
Yeah, I totally get that. And I love how you make a lot of your zines almost like, a square, almost the size of like a postage stamp, bigger, a little bit bigger than that, but they're so like just tiny. I love that. And you just like hold it up. It's just such a cool thing and a cool little package to just tell a micro story or to like celebrate, just, I don't know, just something cool you did or like something cool you saw in a day. Like it doesn't have to be complicated.
Oh, absolutely. And I think what I wanted to do, I was making a lot of mini zines, in my 30s. I think I wanted to challenge the format of what a zine is supposed to represent, right? Like a zine is supposed to represent like somebody's world, or a magazine. Like you open up the pages and it's like somebody's grand old world, like in just these, like in just the confines of these pages. Like you could learn all about the Riot Girl movement in just like, 8 pages of computer paper that was printed. So I wanted to challenge that by making the zines as tiny as possible and see how much information I could pack into such a tiny space and see if I could say something truly profound in that short amount of space with few words, few illustrations, and few pages. And I love the challenge of that. It always felt like playing Tetris with words, or like almost like writing poetry. There's something very poetic about packing all that information into tiny, tiny zine. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think in this day and age of social media too, like when you do something or take on a creative project, even if it's just this little zine, I think a lot of people get stuck on this whole idea of like, if I do something creative, like I need to somehow monetize this or have an Etsy shop. And
yeah, I mean, a lot of my own inclinations are to similarly like, I could have like printed this out and like sold it at a zine fest, or like,
right.
I could like sell this on my Instagram for like $15 if they buy like 10. And I always have that voice in me saying that, but I always tell myself, I don't have time for that. I'm not going to like sit around and like write a bunch of addresses on postcards right. or like, and like do the postage thing. I'm not going to do that. And the other thing I think is that like sometimes, there was a period in my 30s where I was just basically making the zine and then putting them out in the world for anybody to take. So I used to write these like letters, or like these tiny, tiny letters in envelopes, or like tiny zines, and I would leave them on the bus. Because the point for me in making these like small, tiny art installations was to like get the feeling out, keep some of it with photos on Instagram, but then also like let it go and give it away to somebody else, some stranger who might pick it up and then relate to it later on. So yeah, for a series of several months, I did that. I just would leave the zine wherever I made it. And I tried to make the zine in like 5 minutes. And I was very intentional actually about making the zine look as crappy as possible. Because similarly, like I want to make it look, everything's so perfect on Instagram. And I think that like, the zine ethos is to like have it a little bit be like rough around the edges, punk, it's like on the fly. And I kind of wanted to make sure that ethos never got disrupted.
Yeah, if you're doing like a little 8-page zine, which is like a one you can easily do with one sheet of paper, folding it and cutting it a certain way. Do you find yourself, to make sure that you're able to get your point across in the 8 pages, do you kind of like do a rough outline or some sort of a sketch? That way you don't go along and you kind of like run out of pages. You're like, God damn it, I forgot. I ran out of space.
Yeah, absolutely. I often find that like it takes like many, sometimes it takes days. I think about an idea of what I want to say. Maybe it's like I saw this woman who I felt sorry for at the airport, and I thought she was lonely, but then she got a phone call from her family and they were all greeting her happy birthday. And she was basically flying to go and see her family. And I felt that, like my assumption about this poor old woman was wrong. She was actually very much loved, and I shouldn't have assumed that about her. So, for example, I'll be thinking of a story like that for days, and then I'll be like sort of composing the pages in my mind, and then I'll say like, all right, I'm ready to put it down to paper. And sometimes I'll jot little notes to myself about the way that I want to phrase things in my notebook. And then when it comes down to like making the zine, then I'll just go ahead and like pump out those ideas in like 5 minutes or in 10 minutes and just get it done.
In your author bio at the back of the book, it says like, by day you work as an editor on NPR's Science Desk. So we can unpack that a little bit as working around day jobs. But I have to ask, what are you by night?
Oh, what am I by night? I am a zinester, an artist, a cartoonist. Recently I've been very interested in my newsletter and curating these like links of things that I find very beautiful. And I'm actually doing my first collage performance, I'm calling it, of the newsletter, in which I'm like presenting some of the things that I curate in like a 15-minute presentation with sound and lights and audio. So I think that'll be really interesting. So yeah, I guess I see myself as an artist the rest of the time. I've always been inspired by this sticker that I saw in 2008 living in Washington, D.C. The sticker said, "I hate my 9 to 5." And it always like helped me remember that like you're you in the other parts of the day. And that's all a good time to like, I should take advantage of that time to be and express myself and like satisfy all the things that I want to do in that remaining time. I'm not saying that I hate my 9 to 5. I love my 9 to 5, but like I love my other times outside of it too, when I can do whatever else I want.
Yeah, it can be challenging to have or to live a creative life and try to have and put pressure on yourself to have it be like the sole sustenance of what you do. But you've got your gig as a journalist and then your gig as an artist. And so in what ways have you been able to reconcile the two, so like one sort of subsidizes the other, and finding the way to do your cartooning and everything else in the cracks of your life around your day job?
These are very good questions, and you're a very good interviewer.
Well, thank you. It means a lot from someone who works with NPR.
I sit and listen to these interviews all the time for my day job. So yes, you're very good. I would say that there is probably a tipping point that will happen someday where, oh gosh, what a hard question. I would say that for now, like my day job is still giving me is still putting the bread on the table, right? Like, but I want to get my creative work at a point where I can like have that be more of my work and help pay more of the bills so that I can eventually do more of my creative work. But I'm not quite there yet. And I don't know how to I can't do it all. I can't do it all, but I can do it a little bit at a time and eventually do all the things that I want to do, just not all at the same time. I guess to answer your question, I'm sort of like thinking through as I'm talking. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's possible to manage the creative life that I want while having a day job, because the day job requires and demands so much of my attention and energy, and so does my creative life. And it's just as important to me as my day job. I would like to put more energy into my creative life, except I am only one person and I can't do it all. That's what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
It's very hard. You have to see it almost like as like this sliding scale. Like if you can pick up enough cartooning work that replaces like a certain chunk of that steady income, it's like then you can start scaling back from that. But it can be really hard because at some point you have to ramp up the hustle at some point or another. And it's just there's only so many hours and there's only so much bandwidth. And it can just be really, really challenging just to find that time. But it's a hard balance. A lot of people are juggling that. They want their creative stuff to be the thing that mainly sustains them, but it can be really, hard to find the energy and the time to really commit to it in a way that feels.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, I will say that NPR has been really good about letting me do my cartooning and comics at NPR. So like, they've given me the opportunity to make zines and comics for them. And they've been really open to like inviting me to, I think I'm making like a children's zine, a zine for children around climate change in the fall with NPR. And I just think it's going to be really cool. And I'm very, very happy that they were so open to letting me do. I was like, we're going to make a zine and it's going to be printable and we're going to make it available on PDFs online and it's going to be so great. And so they were on board with it. So I was like, okay, this is good. This is a really good sign. I hope that they keep inviting me to do this stuff.
For you, like what makes for a skilled interviewer and what are some things that you notice that other people, a lot of other interviewers are kind of like, they don't quite get correct?
Yeah, I do a lot of interviews. I do a lot of print interviews for NPR's website. I recently interviewed a heavy metal vocalist from Botswana named Vulture. And I interviewed an Oxford philosopher who thinks about the very, very far future. And I'm talking about trillions of years into the future. And so I interview lots of kinds of different people. And I think, and I also advise as an editor, others to, on how to interview and how to get the best interview for a story. And I think that you want to always try to give, this is a word that I made up in my head. You always want the interviewee to give wet answers. And what I mean by wet, I was explaining this to another colleague today. You can't let them speak in generalities. You can't let them get away with speaking in generalities, and you can't let them talk in exposition. You have to have them give examples at every turn because it brings an otherwise dry interview to life. It stimulates the imagination to think about, colors, sounds, feelings, sights. It brings a life into the interview. So that's what I always like to advise people on. And what was the second part of your question? What's a bad interview?
Yeah, like, or some. So to even clarify that further, there are, I think, a lot of people and especially in the podcast sphere, because there's really no restrictions to the amount of time, though there should be.
Oh yeah.
There interviewers, they might ask good questions, but they're bad interviewers in that they are very wordy and they have a bad, what I like to call just a bad shot clock. They just go on and on. They'll ask a question and then answer it and then ask a different one. And like, to me, that's a huge pet peeve of mine. And so I was like, so that's what I noticed. But so like, what do you notice out there too, given that you have such a good ear for it?
Yeah, I think that's similarly. I think that people let it get. That's a really good thing that drives me crazy too. It's like somebody will, all right. Okay. So next question. It's like, you kind of have to keep asking the question until you get the answer. Right. So it's like, oh, so what did you think of that book? Oh, I loved it, man. It's so good. It's so good. All right. So what did you like about the book? Oh yeah, but I read this other book too that was really great. Yeah. But what did you like about that other book? I mean, like, was there any particular part in the book that really resonated to you? Yeah, that part about chapter 3. I love that part. What happened in chapter 3? Tell me what happened in chapter 3. You have to sort of like walk them back to the thing that you want them to get to. You know what I mean? You keep you're like a little shepherd dog, and you're kind of rounding them back to the stable. You know what I
You're
mean?
nipping at their ankles, like, this way,
Yeah,
man.
exactly. That's right. You have to be like super aggressive, or I worked on the science desk for 7 years at NPR, and like I'll just ask them if I like don't know something. I'll be like, all right, like you said, at the beginning of the pandemic, I was like, okay, like, yeah, man, mRNA vaccine. So what is that actually? And he's like, well, it's the most important vaccine. It's like, yes, totally. But what is it? It's like, I'm also not afraid to like make myself a fool, because if I don't know, the audience is not going to know. So you got to be an advocate for the audience.
For sure. And I think that's where a lot of people who might ask decent questions get really insecure and will often ask the question, and then they'll keep going, they'll keep talking, because they want to prove to you that they're smart and that they have an answer for that question too. And in effect, what you just did was give the guest your own answer for them to reply to, when in fact,
that's embarrassing,
right?
I can't even listen to that. It's cringe.
It truly is. And there are a lot of podcasts I used to listen to that now all of a sudden are like, I can't take it, man. I'm like, you've been talking for 3 minutes. Just like, you got like 20 to 30 seconds is plenty of time to get a good question out and then let the guest shine.
Yeah, absolutely. You're supposed to bring the best out of your guests, for sure. You're not supposed to, you're supposed to, yes, let the guest shine and bring out the best in the guest. I'm going to get that tattooed somewhere.
Yes, I love it.
Yeah, you're an editor of them. You're editing them in real time. That's what interviewing is.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I like that. I think I heard an interview too with, it was on long form a couple years ago with, Ira Glass, and that, my God, that must be a hard interview. And there was a point in the interview towards the end where Ira was just like, oh, this is done. Like, this interview was effectively over. Like, he edited it to himself in real time. And it's just like, oh, and then I think it might have been Max Linsky who was doing the interview, and he kind of kept going, and I was like, oh, okay, I guess we're not done. So it was just like,
oh, that's so embarrassing.
I know.
Also,
yeah, and they
oh
they left that tape in, so I thought that was in a sense kind of brave editing on their part, that the fact that they would kind of let that show.
Oh my God, that's so. Oh my gosh, that's so cringy too. I'm
gonna cut in right here just to clarify something. So it's about the 50-minute mark in episode 159 of the long-form podcast, this interview with Ira Glass and Max Linsky, the interviewer, and Ira are talking about their favorite, or they're not their favorite, but their different motives for an interview. Max was merely wanting to talk to Ira, just like, I sent you an email and I just thought it would be great to talk to you. Whereas Ira's main motive for the bulk of his interviewing for This American Life, obviously, is to get a, quote, top for the show. And he's got to do it with, quote, intent. He said it. Then he went on to say that he was a hack, and then said that that's a good ending to edit the show on. But then they fire the mics back up for another round, and they go for about another 20 minutes because Max didn't get to some questions he wanted to get to, and he felt kind of crappy about it. So I was partly right in my recollection of this 2015 interview. Ira did mention that part about him saying he was a hack was a good way to edit and end their interview. So, okay, so I was partially there. Okay, that's why I cut in to clarify. Okay, fine. Okay, back to Malaka.
I just remembered something else too, is that you want to just a couple more things about interviewing. You want to get the person off message. Like, this will always happen. Like, a person comes in, they've got all their talking points, and they're like gonna like try to get to like all the talking points, and it's like, oh my God, let's get you off. Let's get the real you. Let's get the real you shining through. Get you off message. And so I try to get people off message by diffusing the tension in the room. So even if I think I was interviewing a Nobel Peace Prize winner who had won the Nobel Peace Prize for helping women who have been victims of mass rape. And I was just honestly, I don't understand how somebody could rape someone and not feel bad about it. I kind of feel sorry for the men too. And I said it like that, in like literally the same way that I was telling you now. And I think that it was like very off, like it was like surprising for him. And he was like, yeah, it is. Like, I'm glad you said that. Like, it is really depressing for men. Like, they feel really bad and they like feel a lot of guilt and like suffer from PTSD afterward. And like, they're mortified and they suffer from a lot of trauma. And it got us like off this, like, you know, he's been a Nobel Peace Prize winner, so it has like the same jam that he talks about all the time about his work. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And sort of getting him like hitting him left field with a surprising question, I think can get them being like, all right, this interviewer is like, you know, she wants to talk about real stuff. Let's do that.
Yeah, and I curated a quote from Elise Spiegel, who's with This American Life now, and she was with Invisibilia. And I wrote this down. This is actually it was on House Sound. Well, actually, which is now Sound School with PRX, Rob Rosenthal's great show. And interviewing for narrative is an entirely different beast. But she had this to say about it. I kind of want to get your riff on it. She said, you know, you have to gather an interview that gets you to every point in the narrative and gets them to reflect on every moment in the narratives and then delivers every insight they gleaned from their experience. And that's a very punchy quote, but that is, to me, my God, that is very hard to do. And I wonder if maybe you can riff on that and provide your insights to it.
Oh my gosh, my friend, that is like 500 level interviewing style.
Right?
I worked with some really old dogs at NPR. Can I say that? Old dogs, like old, you know, like people who have been there for a real long time at NPR. And like, they have such sophisticated ways of telling stories. I remember I was working with this like really long time correspondent on the science desk. And he was showing me this chart that he made about the arc of the narrative of his story. And he had arcs for several different characters in almost like a line chart that he had manually made. And I just thought, like, wow, like this guy is like really thinking about the flow and like making sure that the audience is coming back full circle to the character. And I don't know, to get to that level, I would love to get to that level someday. I'm still at the 200 level.
There's in your recent newsletter, I love this little image that you posted from Instagram about perseverance and about seeds. And maybe as we sort of start to kind of like pivot and segue closer into your graphic memoir, maybe you can just talk a little bit about this idea of perseverance and what that means and how it's embodied with seeds from flowers.
Oh, I love that. Yeah. I don't know. You know, when I was making it, so what you're referring to is this 4-panel comic in which I tried to make as minimal as possible with minimal text. But it goes something like, in spring I planted many seeds, many of them died, but some sprouted. And that's basically the sentiment of it. And, you know, to me, it felt like a very obvious metaphor for what I had been doing for the past year, which was like, oh my gosh, you know, trying to find a new job. I have a new job now at NPR's Life Kit podcast. Trying to find a new job, you know, making these other projects come to life, and everything just wasn't coming together. And I felt so dejected, but I felt like surely if I keep planting, one of these things will freaking sprout. and they did. And I was like, oh my gosh, it works. Now I'll know forever for the rest of my life that if I ever feel to never be complacent, because if you are complacent, you're not planting seeds. And if you're not planting seeds, nothing will sprout. So you have to like be proactive essentially in life to get what you want. I feel relief now. I'm going to take a break from planting seeds though. I'll tell you that much.
Where did you put, or how did you learn to dance with the rejection and the dejection of that entire sentiment you just expressed?
Oh my God. I actually think that like being a creative person really sets you up for a really, really healthy and very realistic relationship with rejection and critique. Critique is also being critiqued as a creative. You sort of learn to take it, to understand to ask yourself, why was I rejected or critiqued for this particular idea or job or whatever it is, project, to seek to understand it, seek to change it, and seek to do better next time. But I think that creatives are always like throwing themselves, doing this new thing, doing this new project, trying to write this new book, trying to make this zine happen. And, a lot of the stuff doesn't happen, but some of it does. And I think that, I don't know, people in other fields, gosh, I'm sure they don't have to face the same amount of rejection that creatives do. People in bands, musicians, songwriters, artists, pottery makers, I don't know.
Well, speaking of critiquing, in the acknowledgments of your book, you have a little paragraph about giving a shout out to your beta readers. And I wonder for you how you go about soliciting the most constructive feedback, often from people who sometimes want to blunt the edges of the criticism.
Yeah, I actually wrote a guideline for myself that I posted on my Instagram about how to handle criticism. As an editor who gives lots of criticism all the time, it actually forced me, when I was asking for feedback from beta readers, it actually forced me to think about what was actually useful to me and what was actually just, a lot of people don't know how to give criticism, honestly. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
I liked it. Well, you liked it. Why? I hated it. Well, why did you hate it? I just didn't like it. Well, what didn't you like about it? I don't know. You know what I mean?
Just
you get
feeling.
A lot of that.
Yeah.
It's just a feeling that I have, right? And like sometimes, when you ask your friends to beta read something for you, I mean, one of them's a doctor, one of them is like an accountant. Like they're not people who are like well versed in like taking art and like then giving thoughts on it, which is fine. Which is like I wanted a range of ideas and thoughts and stuff. But I think that when you handle critique, you have to be able to articulate very clearly why you feel a particular way about that thing in which you are critiquing. So if it doesn't hold water, and if I can't argue it or talk about it, or we can't expand on it with each other, then I don't really, it doesn't help me. So for example, my first editor, Ben Dela Cruz, I gave him my first book midway into the process. It was about to be published in like 6 months. I gave him the manuscript of my book and I asked him to read it, please. And his edits were so painful because he was right. Mm-hmm. He sent it back to me and he said, I don't like it. And I said, why don't you like it? I mean, like, what do you mean? It's like due in 6 months. What do you mean you don't like it? I was like, well, you repeat the same theme in, from pages 79 through 100. You already said all of that stuff in the previous 3 chapters. So why are you repeating it again? And I was like, oh my God, you're so right. Like I did do that. I didn't even realize that. And then he said, you tend to wrap every chapter up in a neat little bow and it's not believable. And then I looked back and I was like, oh my God, you're right. Your relationship with your husband is not, there's no tension. I feel like this is, you're sugarcoating your relationship with your husband doesn't feel real. And I was like, all right, so what kind of tension do you think I should add? Well, maybe in this section, you can add in a fight that you had, that you feel comfortable sharing. That would make it more believable to the reader. So he had such specific examples in specific places where I could make changes. And that is the kind of edits that I want and the kind of critique that one should give somebody. I know it's kind of like hard to ask people to make those kinds of critiques, but like specific, actionable, something that you could stand behind if I challenged you on it. That's what makes good critique.
All the more challenging, I imagine, for you is that not only do you have the writing component, but you also have an illustration component, and so there is a confluence of these sort of braiding rivers or parallel rivers, if you will. When you're constructing that or generating those kind of pages, what is the sort of internal math, if you will, that you're undergoing when you're like, okay, maybe this should be text narration and maybe this should be an image doing the heavy lifting?
That's a really good question. I don't have like any kind of algorithm that I have. It's just sort of like a gut feeling. So for example, if I say, first of all, I started this new book, It Won't Always Be Like This. I started it as as a text manuscript, 50 pages of written prose, basically, that I then adapted into comic. And I did it all in real time. I didn't even do thumbnails. I just sort of like the day of, like, all right, so like, okay, so we're gonna draw this page. This page is, I got in a fight with my dad. Okay, so anything that was like obviously dialogue is dialogue, right? Anything that is like describing the scene, like, so I was at Dad's house and he was sitting on the chair and I was sitting in the balcony facing him. I don't need to say all that, right?
Yeah.
I just draw it. But then the stuff that is like almost like the connective tissue needs to be the narration part of the graphic novel. So the stuff like, I was 16 when I had my worst fight with Dad. That's stuff that you can't really draw. You can't really, you just kind of got to say it. So I guess that's pretty much the way that I do it. Anything that I can draw, I draw. Anything that I feel like I have to say because it would just be faster or it's more theoretical, I write. And anything that's dialogue is dialogue. And then my favorite part is to remove as much text as possible. So like then I'll go back and do like a text check. And like I like to write with very few words. So I'll just go and remove anything that does not need to be there. I like the tension between the bare narration, a bare drawing. My drawing style is very light and airy. A bare drawing style and like bare dialogue, and like there's power in how they all combine together. And you have to read it in unison. There's no way for you to read just the narration and like, fly through and oh, I understood the story. It all has to work together in a component. I hate when I read graphic novels actually, where it's like there's just too much text. It's like, oh, then what's the art there for? It's just art's there for no reason. You got to let the art do some work too.
Yeah, and when I've spoken to some illustrators about their work on this show, sometimes their frustration with their own work and their own art is by the time they get to the end, they've done, hundreds of panels, and by the time they get to the end, they're already like a better illustrator. So then they go back to the very beginning because those look comparably kind of raw to what happened at the end. Do you ever find yourself in this cycle?
Oh my gosh. I think by the end of the book, you're just like, you know what? Fuck it. It's done. I'm done with this thing. But you have to redraw so many pages because like some things don't work. So like you'll be like, okay, when page 75 needs to be redrawn. Okay, page 32 needs to be redrawn. So like you'll have a lot of inconsistent drawing like throughout the whole book because you get edits in piecemeal.
Last year, I sometimes as a part of this podcast, I do an audio magazine where I'll put out a theme, and one of the themes was summer, and so I got essays on summer, and kind of talked about what summer meant to everybody, and this book is it's a summer book, and what does summer mean to you?
Gosh, what does summer mean to me? A big inspiration for me while I was writing this book was Call Me by Your Name, the film, with what's his face? Who's that guy?
Timothy Chalamet.
Timothy Chalamet. And I thought that captured the essence of summer so beautifully. Summers of your youth. It's like complete and utter and abject boredom and having too much time on your hands and like trying to find ways to fill your time and like feeling anxious about growing up and just you couldn't wait to get your life started. Like summer felt like this big gap in time where you were just trying to rush through it, but you couldn't. It just like was so long and it lasted forever. And I guess then it ends and then it all ends and you're like, oh, I wish I could have that summer again.
Right.
Summer now. And like, I wish to have those days back again.
Yeah. And given that you're, Filipino, Egyptian, American, that's sort of like the tripod of your sort of like cultural and, national identities, you go, you spent your summers in Egypt and so there was often a feeling of like unrootedness that at least something pervade, sort of like an undercurrent of this that I felt, the kind of pulse going through it. And I wonder for you, like, just given that, you would spend so much time, say, in Egypt, then the rest of your time in the States, how you went about forging your own voice and your own identity as a young woman and then into your adulthood.
What do you mean?
I guess just, getting to a sense of, knowing who you are at your core, given that there was such a sort of, over the course of a year, a very sort of transient nature where you spent so much time in a foreign country than back here, then maybe there's just an unrootedness and maybe sometimes a difficulty in finding your own identity and your own voice.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I would say that I did have one constant, and that was my diaries, and which I still have now. And I think they always rooted me into knowing, like, I always have this, when I wrote in my diary as a young person, the diary was always with me, from whether I was in the States with my mom or flying to Egypt and being in freaking, I don't know, Sharm el-Sheikh or like Alexandria or somewhere random in Egypt. I always had my diary with me, and I had my memories from who I was the months before or even the year before. And I felt like that kept me grounded to know what my inner voice was. As far as like understanding my identities, I mean, I feel like I only recently started to unpack my feelings around my identity as somebody in my late 20s and early 30s. I had just sort of lived my whole life trying to and aspiring to be a white American person, and didn't think or consider too much about my Arab or Filipino sides to my sadness. I mean, I spent so many years trying to fixated on trying to be like a white American when I could have been leaning into and very proud of my Arab and Asian heritages.
Yeah. I guess that was maybe a poorly phrased question, but it just, I don't know, I just got a sense of it might just being in different cultures that are familiar, but like even when you go to Egypt, you're the American, you're a proud American there, and then yeah, it was just
I see what you mean, like being in different places. How did I reckon with my cultures in different places?
Yeah, that is pretty, that is exactly what I'm getting at, and I just couldn't phrase it that way. No,
that's okay. I guess like in Egypt, my dad had encouraged me to be very proud of being American, yet at the same time, and he always told people like, oh, my daughter's from California. She lives by Disneyland. She has a really like when I spoke, he loved the fact that I had a perfect American accent. But at the same time, he wanted me to be an Arab woman, to dress a certain way, to act a certain way, to talk a certain way. When I was around other people, like have, very demure mannerisms. And that really freaking annoyed me, because he wanted me to be both things, but only one thing, it seemed like. He wanted me to be an Arab, but also an American. And that was a very hard, it's hard to be both things. And then my Filipino side, I had to sort of push that down, because in the Arab world, Filipinos make up the majority of the labor class. And so I didn't want people to make assumptions about me or my family. My dad didn't even tell people that he had been previously married to a Filipina, because the joke would have been then, so did you marry your maid? So I never told people that. I kept that all to myself. I think that code switching is different in the US for sure, but it certainly is different in Egypt, where I wanted to fit in as an Arab, and I looked Arab, but I didn't act Arab. I wasn't Arab enough.
And what I think your book does extremely well, and which I think my favorite memoirs do very well, is they don't solely dwell on the author's hangups and insecurities and whatever. It looks outward, and this story is very much, to me, like a lot about Hala and your father, and I loved your seeing their stories as filtered through you as a child, an adolescent, and a young adult. In your telling of this story, how important was it for you to illustrate their perspectives and their point of view and their changes over the course of your young life?
Yeah, I wanted to use Hala and Dad's relationship as I want to use their relationship as a device for me understanding the real world. Like as I aged, I understood their dynamic more 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 clearly through the eyes of an adult. And their relationship also helped me grow up as a person. Their difficult relationship helped me grow up as a woman, in knowing the hard, real things of our life and world in relationships. Hala and Dad both read the manuscripts of the book, and I did not allow them to. I told them I would not sign this book contract until they like vetted the book and signed off on it.
Mm-hmm.
So my stepmom Hala doesn't speak English, so I paid my brother $25 a chapter to translate the whole book for her and take notes on her end, and then I painstakingly made the notes in the book back so that we would all be in agreement of like what this book was. And I also, my dad and Hala, like, you know, spoiler alert, they eventually get a divorce, but you know, they're exes with each other, so they're not super close. So I didn't want to get like, I had to make sure that each of them were comfortable with what the other was saying about them. So that was like just a lot of back and forth between the both of them, and like, you know, Hala would say like, well, I didn't see it that way. And then my dad would be like, well, I did. So you choose, Malaka. Like, what do you want? How do you want to portray this? So that was pretty hard. But ultimately, I think my dad said that after he read my book, he cried for like a day and a half, because I think that was the first time that he really felt seen, in terms of what had happened in the afterfall of his divorce and what he had been really trying to do in Egypt for all those years. And for my stepmom, Hala was a hero of the book, and she just, you know, we did an interview together yesterday for a news publication. My sister Salma translated, and she basically said that, you know, you had caught so many things in our lives that I had forgotten or just didn't realize that you would notice. And she said that it really touched her, and she felt really proud to be part of the book. And, you know, I think I want to say one thing, that like in the Arab world, people are very private. People are very, very deeply private. They always show their best face forward. You never want to show weakness to others. It's a very social society, right? And so you want to show your best. You don't want to air your dirty laundry out to the world. This is just something that's not done in the Arab world. And so the fact that they both let me write about their divorce in such an open way is like really monumental, I think. My dad was like, I was really shocked. And he said, well, what did you expect? Did you expect that because I'm an Arab man that I would say no? And I was like, yeah, kind of. And he's like, no, I love you, and I'll support you in whatever you do. And he also said, I don't think that anyone in our family would read this anyway, so you're free to do whatever you want. So I was like, okay. As long as Dad and Hala are like fine with it, then I'm fine with it.
There's a moment in the book too where you and your father have a big fight, but in the end you decide to like kind of ask for a sandwich from him, and he's so happy to make you the sandwich, and there are no words exchanged really. It's just an exchange with food. And I remember that being like when I was reading that the first time, it was just such a poignant scene, and like even made my eyes burn a bit because it was like so evocative and so touching that you guys, no words needed to be said in that moment. It was just like, let's enjoy this little meal together.
Yeah. I think that that's how so many of our fights go in childhood, though, right? Like, you don't say sorry, mom. Like, you don't do that, really. You're like, you just sort of like let the fight settle, and then you kind of resume normalcy at a certain point, and then all is forgiven and all is forgotten. And I think that that's how real life is. You know, there's never this like big moment where you're like, it's okay, son, I love you. Come into my arms and I'll give you a hug and everything will be all right. Like, that's not how it works in the real world. And I thought that was actually something that really happened. I drew a comic in my diary when I was 16. I think that was a year that happened. and I had told Dad that I didn't want any of the food that he was giving me. And so I felt bad later about it. And I was like, all right, I'll have a sandwich or whatever. And yeah, all was forgiven.
How did you settle on how you drew yourself as a young child, as a teenager, and then as a young adult?
Here's something that's crazy is like, I've been drawing myself the same way for years, like since I was a kid. Like, I don't have any choice. Like, you know, one of the critiques on Goodreads, which I know I'm not supposed to be reading, but like one of the critiques is like, I hate her drawing style. She draws so childishly. And I'm like, dude, I wish I could draw any other way. This is literally just what comes out of my hands when I draw. Like, this is how I see myself. I see myself as a big round head, pumpkin head with crazy frizzy hair and like big bugging eyes and like an insane, like always insane mannerisms with my like hands or my eyebrows or my mouth. I'm a very animated person. Like I'm actually just making animations with my hands right now as we're talking. So I like, that's just how I feel. The way that I draw myself is how I feel like I expressively identify as myself.
And as I'm paging through the book here too, and I'm just seeing these moments where towards the end in the final quarter where, you know, Hala is really expressing to you how unhappy she is and how trapped she feels, and it's something that, you know, she confides in you. And I wonder for you, just harboring those feelings or taking on those feelings, you know, between, you know, two adults, so, you know, parental figures, like. Was that like, what was that like for you as you were had to take that on and internalize a lot of this internal strife from your parental figures?
I think that's a big part of growing up, right? Like we start to see our parents as people. And that was a big growing up moment for me when Hala was telling me about her unhappiness with my dad, but then me feeling this tension to be loyal to my dad because he was my dad. He was the first person who was in my life before Hala, and I had allegiance to him, not Hala. But I'd also developed a very deep and profound relationship with Hala over the years too, so I also felt allegiance toward her. But as a young adult, I had to make the decision of what to do in that particular situation. Would I go to Dad and tell him everything, or would I empathize with Hala and sort of keep her secrets and be her confidant? And I decided at that moment that I would be her confidant and just, you know, be there for her. And that was a hard choice to make as an adult. And I also felt a lot of sympathy for my dad at that moment too. I sort of saw the writing on the wall that if Hala was unhappy now, she was probably going to leave him. And I didn't know what position that would leave her children. I also understood that Hala was a woman in the Arab world who had never worked a day in her life. What would become of her position if she had left my dad? Where would she find work? Where would she get money? Would she be able to afford to take the kids? Like these very real problems started to emerge. And, you know, I was only like 20 years old when we had that conversation. I was also trying to figure out my own life outside of my life in Egypt. You know, trying to finish up college, trying to think about my next internship. And meanwhile, my family was sort of falling apart. And I was, all these summers that I had sort of lamented having to endure, you know, being dragged to Egypt and whatnot, as my dad put it in yesterday's interview, you know, being dragged to Egypt, it sort of like was put in perspective. I had this like moment where I was like, wait, is this it? Is this all I'm going to get with the whole family unit together? Like, I thought we were this perfect little thing. Even though it was really hard, I thought we were like this perfect little unit.
You're drawn in you usually have red on in every panel. So what's the significance of the color red?
Oh, the red's nothing. I mean, like, I think the red is from like the previous book where I was always wearing red. But red is like just to make me just, you know, it's like Homer Simpson's always wearing like the same outfit. Right. It's very similar. It's like, I'm just for consistency's sake, just in case you don't know who I am, here I am in the red shirt. Right. And Hal is always wearing like yellow and purple too.
Yeah. Over the course of, say, the writing of this and the drawing of this, you know, what did you come to any sort of, you know, revelation or maybe a greater understanding of who Hala and is and was, and who your father is and was throughout this process?
Yeah, absolutely. Writing is about discovery, and I spent 2 years navel gazing at this one particular part of my life. This part of my life that was all my childhood summers in Egypt. If you thought about anything for 2 years, I'm sure you'll come up with some revelations, right?
Right.
This is what I realized. I realized that my dad tried so hard to make a family. He tried so hard to remarry, to have kids, to try to bring me along for this ride in creating his new family unit, and to have me join in on that. He tried so hard, and he just wasn't good at it. He had kind of had it for a while, and sort of failed at it. Eventually with their divorce. I loved my dad for all that effort, for all the effort that he put into trying to foster this relationship with me and try to bring him into this new section of his life. I loved my dad for that. I thought that I had a newfound respect for him, and I never appreciated how much work and energy it took for him to probably convince his wife, hey, can we have my 17-year-old daughter come around this summer again? I'm sure that was super annoying. Super annoying. And then I was a teenager, so I was being annoying anyways, trying to be cool, trying to be, distant with my family because I was too cool, And then with Hala, I realized a lot of things. I learned a lot of things from her. One, that in life, it's possible to create really profound relationships with people without language, without common language, without common culture. Without anything at all, it's possible to create extremely profound and deep relationships. And, I also learned from her that power comes in different ways. She was a very typical Arab woman, right? She was, she was a housewife, and she was a stay-at-home mother. We'll put it that way. She was a stay-at-home mother. She, she didn't work. She deferred to my dad for a lot of things, but she showed her power in lots of ways, and she ended up being the most courageous person I have ever met in my entire life. And I won't spoil the book on that. And then lastly, the things that happen in life, they're not going to stick around forever, and they may be really hard at the moment, and they were certainly hard for me. Awkward and lonely and confusing and weird, trying to be in this blended family. But there are good times in those moments too, and when they're gone, that's all you're gonna get. And it will not always be like that, as the book cover suggests. It won't always be like this, our lives.
Well, it gets to a point of something you shared recently in your newsletter. It's very high on the bittersweet scale.
Yeah, it is. It's a very high on the bittersweet scale. I wanted to create a work that could show I wanted to create a work that would explore connection without language and context. And it just so happened to now take place in the Middle East, a place that I feel is not often represented in American media, not represented well. And not represented, just not represented well or often.
No, well, what we see is beige and rubble over here.
Beige and rubble. That was actually a particular color choice. I said I wanted vibrant colors only for my book. So the book uses as vibrant a color palette as possible. But yeah, I was very proud to also let people into the world of the Arab home, not an Arab American home, an Arab home in the Middle East, which I think is even more elusive to a lot of Americans.
And Malaka, as I like to bring these conversations down for a landing, I always like asking the guest for a recommendation for the listeners of some kind, and that can be anything. So I extend that to you. What would you recommend for listeners out there?
Okay, so the thing that I'll recommend a poem, and I'll recommend an app that I really like. Can I recommend two things?
Oh, absolutely. Go for it.
Okay, so the poem that I love and is very dear to me over the past few years has been John Berger's "And Our Faces, My Heart, Briefest Photos." It's one of the most beautiful poems I've ever read, and I'd like for you to read it too if you have a chance.
Sure. Yeah, I'll have to.
And then the second thing I would love to recommend is the app Autumn. I sound like I'm like an advertiser, but like I really love Autumn. It just like reads you long form articles and it like audio version, and it's just the best way to like kill 30 minutes while you're walking around your neighborhood.
Fantastic. Well, I love it. I have been a fan of your work for a while, and this is really a thrill to get to talk to you in depth about how you go about the living a creative life, and then of course the making and the storytelling behind this incredible graphic memoir that you've written. So thanks so much for the work, and thanks for carving out the time to do this, Malaka.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for the incredibly thoughtful questions and such great interviewing. I enjoyed my time with you.
We did it again, CNFers. Don't ask me how. I swear, I just don't get it. Though I rearranged my office, which was kind of disorienting but kind of cool, and it gave me better access to my big wall calendars, and I've been starting to put on those calendars like when I need to start a book, when I need to finish a book, when I've got certain interviews scheduled, when certain ones are publishing, and suddenly the helicopter view is allowing me to see the production schedule of the show and makes me feel more like Tom Brady in the pocket versus, say, anyone else other than Tom Brady. Thank you to Malaka Gharib. What a fun conversation. I adore her. I adore her work, and I can't wait to see what she comes up with next. In the meantime, it won't always be like this. Published by 10 Speed Press. It's just such a cool book. I can't recommend it enough. I really can't. I cannot recommend it enough. Do I even have a parting shot today? Oh, yeah, I did tease one out. Anyway, here it is. I put out a little survey to the CNF Pod members at the Patreon page. That's patreon.com/CNFpod. If you want to window shop and throw a few bucks into the coffers for our world domination, the money, it's the only money I make from this podcast, and it's from the Patreon crew. Lest you think I'm getting wealthy in these parts. I put out a poll about the transcript situation. Yay or nay? Should I keep doing them? Do you get value out of them? And it was a resounding nay. Not because they're bad and not because they don't necessarily offer value, but because nobody really has the time to read them. They is an audio format, duh. And so listeners were like, yeah, we just like the audio component of it. We don't need the transcript. And everyone appears to be super happy with the podcast itself as a product, so they don't feel like they need anything extra. I want to deliver something extra because giving a few bucks, like 2 or 4 or 10 to the show every month is incredibly generous. Like, here is this thing that was free and is free, and it was for many years, and then I started putting out the collection plate. It's very hard to start to throw money into that, or it's very hard when someone like me or any podcast host or any creator of any kind starts putting around that collection plate after they've been giving the thing out for free. And then suddenly you're like, hey, by the way, it would be awesome if you contributed. And I understand why it's a very hard bridge or river to cross, or, like this, oh, it's coming out free anyway, why would I pay you? I understand. So I still want to deliver a little something extra. I feel regarding the transcripts, I was feeling guilty. I couldn't keep pace with cleaning them up and then offering those to the Patreon crew. So this takes a lot of pressure off me, and I'll likely offer up some goodies here and there, like when I shared my query tracker. That seemed to go over really well. And whenever my book proposal sells, if it sells, I'll share that, because book proposals are such a weird territory to navigate. Nobody has much by way of concrete answers as to how they should be done, and lots of people are weird about sharing theirs, even after their book is published. I don't know. It's like looking in someone's medicine cabinet, I guess. I don't know. Point being, I will throw some goodies towards the Patreon crew, like lightning bolt buttons. Holy shit. I'm also thinking of moving the CNF and Happy Hour to the Patreon page. It's something I did for and with the newsletter crowd and the regulars. Shout out to Suzanne and Betsy. They are members. The other regular is Lori, and she's not a Patreon member, but I'd grandfather in, as she's not a member of the Patreon page. No bigs. It's no big deal, man. But she shows up to the happy hours whenever I put out the code in the newsletter, and she shows up like clockwork from the Florida Panhandle, and I would grandfather someone like Lori in. I have that kind of power, man, and I wield it like Mjolnir. Mjolnir. Ugh. Hey, as you can tell, I'm staying wild. You do the same. Stay wild, CNFers, and if you can't do, interview. See ya.